Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. George was close to Ringo, but between Paul and John, it was John that George liked to hang out with the most. George said he first met Paul on a bus coming home from school, sitting by himself and laughing, and I thought we had a real nut on our hands. And Paul came around to my house one evening to look at the guitar manual I had, which I could never work out, Harrison said, per the Beatles' authorized biography by Hunter Davies. It was still in the cupboard. We learned a couple of chords from it and managed to play Don't You Rock Me Daddy-O with 2 chords. We used to play on our own, not in any group, just listening to each other and pinching anything from any other lad who could do better. So while he was good friends with Paul McCartney, Harrison admitted that he found Lennon more impressive. Then 1969 hit the band just as they were about to break up. It didn't help that John was delving more into drugs. It was at this time, too, that he decided Yoko was the woman for him. The band wouldn't have minded if John had just been in the studio without her. But let's not go too much into that. Today we're going to see the relationship between John and George through the years. George and John meet. This was due to Paul McCartney. George was just 14 years old when he met John Lennon, who was 17. John wasn't too keen on the idea because George was so young. Paul kept trying to get him to join up in the band, and John had hesitation. So they came up with the idea that George would audition. George was granted an audition on the upper deck of a bus where he wowed Lennon with his rendition of popular American rock riffs. They shared a love for rock and roll, blues, and later Indian classical music. According to CheatSheet.com, Harrison often invited Lennon out to go out with him, but the older boy resisted at first. George was just too young. I didn't want to know him at first, Lennon said. He was doing a delivery around and just seemed a kid. He came around once and asked me to go to the pictures with him, but I pretended I was busy. I didn't dig him on the first sight till I got to know him. Eventually, though, Lennon warmed up to Harrison. How they bonded? Well, it was in the 1960s, both George and John started to experiment with drugs, especially LSD, and it brought them closer together. And they also enjoyed Indian music. And then let's see how their friendship kind of fell apart. By 1968, the friendship was starting to fall apart. It was somewhat due to Yoko, but also due to John's lack of respect for George's songwriting abilities. George Martin said in 1969 there was a fist fight between John and George, but in 1970 they bonded again when Ringo and George and John went against Paul McCartney. So John and George remained friends and recorded together on John's Imagine album, but their friendship fell apart as the 70s dragged on. Another thing that happened was that George asked John to perform the concert for Bangladesh in 1971. John wanted Yoko to do the concert with him, and George didn't want Yoko, claiming he didn't want any avant-garde music. So John refused to do the concert, and some felt George considered that a snub, because he'd helped John with the Imagine album, especially the song How Do You Sleep. Another thing that didn't help the friendship was that John was hurt by George's book I Me Mine because he didn't say very much about him. According to CheatSheet.com, John said, by glaring omission in the book, my influence on his life was absolutely zilch and nil. In his book, which is purportedly this clarity of vision of each song he wrote and its influences, he remembers every 2-bit sax player or guitarist he met in subsequent years. I'm not in the book. But John didn't stop there. He described their early relationship as one of him being the leader and George was like his disciple, and John even compared George to the fans that hung around his New York apartment, hoping to make contact with him and Yoko. Well, it seems like John took things a little too personally. George didn't write much about his own life in the book, nor did he write about the Beatles. So next we have George disagreed with John's song, Give Peace a Chance. George contrasted himself with John. This is where I really disagree with John because I want peace too, he said, but I don't think you get peace by going around shouting, give peace a chance, man. For a forest to be green, each tree must be green. You don't get peace by talking about peace. You don't get any sort of peace until you really stop talking and be more on the road to peace. And George compared this phenomenon to LSD. It's like acid. People took acid in order to have some higher state of consciousness, but it doesn't work, he added. To get God conscious, you have to stop taking pills and stop all that scene. So Give Peace a Chance was an international hit, but George felt it wasn't going to make the world more peaceful. how George responded to John. So John made his critiques of George in an interview to Playboy, and George didn't have much of a chance to respond because shortly thereafter, John was killed. In 1987, George said, John didn't have as a significant an impact on him as John claimed. While writing I Me Mine, George didn't want to get into John helping him on Taxman. George didn't see the point since he had helped John on plenty of songs and didn't expect recognition. As for John's claims that George followed him around as a kid, George said John misread him, as he and Paul always did. Well, that part I don't know about. I have read Cynthia's book about John, and she said how George would follow her and John around, and John also brought it up more than a few times. And George was young, and I'm sure he did look up to John because he was 14 at the time and John was 17. And then George explained that John was annoyed because I didn't say that he had written one line of the song Taxman. The point to that was I also didn't say how I wrote 2 lines to Come Together or 3 lines to Eleanor Rigby. I wasn't getting into any of that. I think in the balance I would have had more things to be niggled with him about than he would with me. And George laughed at John's claims that he idolized him as a young boy. Well, that's what he thought, George giggled. I liked him very much. He was a groove, he was a good lad, but at the same time he misread me. Another time George told a different story. I was very impressed by John, he said, probably more than Paul, or I showed it more. I loved John's blue jeans and lilac shirt and sideys, but I suppose I was impressed by all the art college crowd. John was very sarcastic, always trying to bring you down, but I either took no notice or gave him the same back, and it worked. According to CheatSheets.com, later John offered George an olive branch by inviting him to work on How Do You Sleep in 1971, and after that the pair rarely stayed in touch. Still, John popped up in George's conversation with friends. Tom Petty said George admired John a lot, wanted John's acceptance pretty bad, and thought John would become a traveling Wilbury in a heartbeat. George's friend Jim Keltner saw the same thing. During a press conference in 1974, per George Harrison on George Harrison, George said he'd be in a band again with John in a heartbeat. Paul didn't get the honor. John had gone through all his scenes, but he's like me, he came back around, George said. To tell the truth, I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but I couldn't join a band with Paul McCartney. But it's nothing personal, it's just from a musical point of view. And then George and John saw each other a couple of times before John's death in 1980. According to UltimateClassicRock.com, the exact date of the last meeting between George Harrison and John Lennon is unknown, but Harrison said in a 1990 interview that it was 2 years before John was killed. I was in New York at his house at the Dakota, Harrison recalled. He was nice. He was just sort of running around the house making dinner. Harrison was surprised to discover Lennon had hundreds of cassettes of Indian music, given his former bandmate's attitude when Harrison introduced those exotic sounds into the studio during the Beatles era. He grew into it, Harrison added. Lastly, George wrote a song and performed a video about John entitled All Those Years Ago. This was a tribute to John, and I'm sure John would have smiled hearing it. In an interview after John Lennon was shot, George said he had originally written most of the lyrics for Ringo, but with Lennon's assassination, he rewrote the lyrics and told how he looked up to John. Al Cooper gives an eyewitness account of George Harrison's reaction to hearing the news that John Lennon had been shot. George was in the kitchen, white as a sheet, really shook up. We all had breakfast. He took calls from Paul and Yoko, which actually seemed to help his spirit. And then we went into the studio and started the day's work. Ray and I kept George's wine glass full all day, working till midnight, and some of the work from this session ended up on the album somewhere in England. In the song All Those Years Ago, there's a lyric in the song that said what John had always thought, that George looked up to him. So George's lyrics went, living with good and bad, I always looked up to you. Now we're left cold and sad by someone, the devil's best friend, someone who offended all. I'm sure that had John lived longer, George and John would still have remained friends. They have been like brothers since their teens and loved one another, and that is why they felt hurt by the other at times. They had a bond that would never be broken. I hope everybody's enjoyed the video. If you did, if you would give it a thumbs up, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you do that, you'll be given notice of when a new video is posted. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.